All right. John, can you hear me all right? We're here, I think. Yeah.
Yep, I think we're live. First time
It
on
seems like
LinkedIn.
years since we've spoken, right?
Yeah.
Okay, listen. So thank you everyone for being here. We're going to talk a little bit about Sunburst today, and most with a special emphasis on. There's been a lot of coverage around Sunburst as a thing, its TTPs and its sort of broader implications. And here we're going to talk today a little bit about the lessons learned and sort of, as an industry, regardless of where you fall on the spectrum of industry or the maturity level or the size of the organization, for everybody included, what can we pull forward to hopefully mitigate this type of risk in the future? So before we do that, I'm going to introduce myself. John, I'll let you introduce yours. My name is Matt Cauthorn, and I'm the Vice President of Field Security here at ExtraHop. John?
John Smith, that really is my name. So not sure what my parents were thinking, but I am a principal security engineer here at ExtraHop.
So guys, for all of the practitioners out there, John has the dubious distinction of being prematurely obfuscated from the internet just by the sheer volume of John Smith references out there.
I can still hide out.
You're hiding in plain sight, Okay. A couple of rules of engagement. Feel free. It's one rule of engagement, basically, and one caveat. John and I are really, really casual. We've known each other for many, many years, and we both come from the trenches of IT operations and bear the mental scars that come along with that, I suppose, unfortunately. So we're very, very casual, and in the spirit of a casual conversation, feel free to chime in with questions if you've got them. If not, we hope you find this valuable. So, hey, John, what I'm going to do is I'll let you start with like a brief recap there might be a handful of people out there that are less familiar for various different reasons around Sunburst. So you want to give us the quick and dirty recap?
Yeah, well, so, I'm sure everyone's heard of Sunburst, but basically it was a supply chain attack, or what sometimes is called a watering hole attack, where basically they were able to contaminate an update of the SolarWinds solution. SolarWinds is a pretty common, very affordable piece of software that we use. I think all of us have used it who've been in ops. And so now you have this sort of self-signed piece of software that basically gets pushed down. It did a lot of it was very sophisticated. The naming conventions for some of the command and control was using the AWS naming conventions. So it was actually trying to fool humans. It tried to evade endpoint detection, antivirus detection. It actually tried to disable installed endpoint detection and response. So it was really just this crazy complicated, and then actually programmatically made decisions based on DNS responses. This is far and away, since I've been doing this over 20 years, this is far and away the most complicated attack that I've seen.
Yeah, and I would draw a bit of a distinction on the sort of stage of the sophistication where to me, and I'd love your thoughts on this too, but John, it seemed really, really sophisticated in the early stages, that sort of initial compromise. And we can talk about how this initial compromise was altogether different than standard initial compromise via phishing and other sort of coercive attempts, right? But this one was really, really sophisticated in how patient it was, how actively it evaded defenses, very actively evading defense, and then sort of just chilling out and waiting, assessing the situation, re-enabling itself randomly in a 2-week period of time, and then sort of raging on, God forbid, raging on after things had sort of, it decided to do its thing. So it was definitely really sophisticated on that front. And you're right, the part that was, they went to some great lengths, and it seemed to sort of imply heavy levels of sponsorship from somewhere as to just how globally distributed it was and how sort of coordinated and intentional it was.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so the nature of this thing, and you've got I don't want to jump too far afield here, but John, for those of you who don't know, our preemptively obfuscated John Smith, he's got all these pithy stories and sort of aphorisms and metaphors to fall back on to describe these things. And one of the horrifying parts to me, And frankly, I don't think anyone has answers here. We're going to start to approximate, or at least hopefully converge on ways to improve the risk profile of any given organization for these things. Just as a supply chain vector, it was really, really horrible because this thing runs with privilege and it's in the belly of the beast already. As an adversary, if I'm attacking you, I want to get into the sort of near the server assets so I can invoke, actions on my objectives. Well, this one was effectively like just drop shipped in official packaging, no less, into the environment with privileges. In many cases, people have to, solutions like this in general have pre-configured domain rights of some sort all the way up to domain admin and beyond. And so now you're on this sort of fast track, low friction corridor to do really, really bad things. And so what was the metaphor? Was it it was a vampire? What was that vampire
Yeah,
story?
so it was an abstract I wrote for a Sans talk. But basically, it said, from Bram Stoker all the way to Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and a vampire has to be invited in, right? If a vampire shows up at your front door in full regalia and big fangs, you're certainly not going to let them in, right? They're certainly not going to be invited in. Here, they are part of an update, a signed up software update, and look. Thousands of customers invited the vampire into their homes, unsuspectedly. The point is that this was they were masters of disguise, masters of evasion, and unlike a lot of attacks, there wasn't this initial compromise. They sort of skipped that part, and now they were just suddenly moving laterally in your environment. So it was very, very, very slick.
Yeah. So So we're going to refer to this a little bit later, but we've written a security report with some customer stories and some sort of war stories about this one in particular, which we'll point you all to a little bit later on. But there's several different customer stories in there, which we can briefly touch on here, where, spanning multiple industries. And John, I think at some point, and I'm sort of building some of the agenda on the fly here, where I think you and I are going to want to talk about tooling strategies and ways to invoke those tooling strategies in a sensible, sort of scale-friendly, cost-effective way. So don't let me forget to do that, please. We have some customer stories that range from the sort of spectrum of, hey, I have the software running. Now I need to look backwards in time. This is a crucial distinction about this one, is it really forced the industry, especially from the perspective of, because it so actively evaded defenses, it forced the industry to look backwards in time retroactively. So for me, John, at least, it really blurred the lines between these historical roles. Like if you have a Venn diagram of three circles, this monster convergence of like threat hunting, forensics, and detection itself. And it was all done after the initial disclosure was made by FireEye. It was all done retroactively. I had to look back. We had one customer going all the way back to 2019, looking at network-based intel, trying to figure out if they had indicators. And so this one was pretty unique in that way. What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, it's a big shining examples of why detections aren't enough, right? You need to be able to do that backward investigating. We don't know that there's going to be a signature available for the next big attack, right? In fact, one of my battle cries when we first started building network detection and response-based machine learning was that I don't know what the next big breach is going to be, but I know that the systems impacted will start behaving drastically differently. That's exactly what we saw here. So in addition to being able to see, what was it, I think 150% increase in some lateral movement detections, also being able to go back in time and search, hey, this hit 6 months ago. What did I have any traffic that matched those IOCs 6 months ago? And it's really tough I was a big SIM guy back in the day, and having 6 months worth of logs is, especially egress, right? That's pretty tough to try to, not just from a querying standpoint, but from a disk and IOPS standpoint, querying that much data is very, very challenging for sure.
It really is. And didn't you have another variation of that same thing where you said, I heard you say at one point, we were with a customer or something like, you don't know what the next 0 day would be, but you have a feeling it's going to involve at least 2 hosts and a network. right? Right.
Well, part of what we're hoping to show the audience here is we're a network detection and response solution, and we're relatively new in terms of the SOC triad, right? You've got EDR, very mature. Next gen EDR is fantastic. We've had the SIM, which has been a tried and true solution. I would say maybe it's a quad, maybe not a triad. I see threat intelligence also being very important.
Yeah, totally.
But we're sort of new, and so if you look at that's exactly what it is. It'll involve one host talking to another host. And what we're getting at is that if you look at lateral movement today, we're talking about, especially with Sunburst as well, you're talking Windows WMI, you're talking Kerberos, you're talking CIFS, you're talking, remote procedure call. A lot of our solutions are built around logs. And so those protocols don't log. And so there's all of this opacity around those, but the metadata that's available on the network is actually quite rich. And so, having the ability to see that metadata on the network, and the issue is again, these protocols don't log. So it's not that the SIM isn't a good solution. There is a dearth of intelligence when you try to get it out of Windows Event Viewer. And so really the only source of good metadata to build good ML algorithms is the network. And so, that's also where we saw a drastic change in behavior. Like I said, and if you look at the security report, it's not a difficult read. You'll see there was a 150% spike. And I remember I had a customer where we literally said, hey, we had a SYN scan, eyebrow raising, but maybe not a SEV1. But then we had a domain, a controller enumeration from the same host. So it's scanning for 445. And then we have a second event of it doing, hey, somebody's using 80find or net, you living off the land to try to do some reconnaissance. Those two together are quite concerning. And I remember hearing back from the person, well, my EDR doesn't say anything, right? So now we circle back to the Sunburst where it was specifically engineered to evade the EDR and if not outright disable it. So, I think defense in depth is good. Having some overlap is good because some solutions, some solutions can be evaded, some solutions can be disabled. NDR solutions operate in a covert position. The attacker doesn't know that we're there. And so because we're sitting in a covert position, you can't hide from us. So long-winded answer there. I don't know if you wanted that long.
No, there's some comments. Yeah, I've got some comments on that. And this is really important. So for this particular one, and I'll go back to the ML discussion really quickly. So I think that ML suits really well, especially for some of in the modern era of endpoint in EDR, and it's working really well. There's folks out there that you can find them very quickly, and partners of ours that do a wonderful job with EDR-based ML. The challenge with this particular attack is that it just so actively evaded traditional defenses, right? And that's the key. And so the answer there is the covert analysis of the passive sort of out of band covert analysis of NDR, right? And that's when you think of, and I promised to get to this, and I guess we've arrived just organically, John. So when you think of the tooling and the sort of three pillars, and I agree with you, there's Paul Azadorian of Security Weekly actually convinced me of this, that there's threat intelligence as well. I had to think about it at first, and then he was right? So hello, Paul. So anyways, we have these data sources available to us in the SOC as a part of the practice, and that goes all the way from the top level sort of risk framework, the RMF framework, all the way through to your security controls and your control frameworks, right? These data sources are typically comprised of, and in fact, we embrace this model very actively, network, EDR, and SIM, right? Because between the three, and then throw in threat intelligence, and all of those other things can be the beneficiary of the threat of the TI, right? And so between those three things, you end up with this very, very complementary. So for example, just to be super clear, we do passive analysis. It's very transactionally fluent. We can do decryption at scale and actually get inside of layer 7 transactions and do this preemptive analysis. When a malware lands on a host and starts executing, that's a wonderful use case for EDR. And so it's a very complementary strategy in that way, right? And then the operating system itself and some processes, depending on which and how they're configured will log actively as well. And so now the SIM can sort of federate these two different viewpoints. So it's a very, very, very strategic use. So when we talk about lessons learned, I got to say from this one, I really, really think that this drove home the uncontestable truth of like, you really need to be strategic about your tooling. John, you and I both came from operational histories where the tooling strategy was much more of this sort of point solution driven thing that approximated a shotgun blast of solutions that were not federated or working well together in any way. And for the modern era of threat management and risk assessment, threat modeling, threat hunting, and detection and response, that just doesn't work anymore. Like, you need something that's a lot more sort of strategic and complementary.
Yep.
I matched your long answer with a longer comment.
Okay. Yeah.
So, okay. And we'll probably touch back on this one, but so John, like from this one was raging around, or maybe like sort of waking and sleeping and being methodical for months and months and months. And so we're right back to years ago, you and I, this is going back 3-4 years now. We're talking about dwell time as this sort of the silent killer of, it's like it's literally the silent killer of security in the enterprise.
Yep.
Yeah. So why do you think this one stuck around for so long?
Well, you had evasion techniques, right? So I think those were very effective, right? They were patient. They would pop their head out of the hole and then hide again if certain antivirus, things were enabled. So the evasion techniques were very good. But again, I'm going to go back to legacy protocols, right? I don't know if those of you that have been in the industry a long time, one of the big things in Windows 2000 was that we were rolling out Kerberos, and we were all clapping, and that's all great. But that was 20 years ago, and it was a 10-year-old protocol then. So, with that, we have some legacy protocols that don't log well. So if you look at your traditional tools, EDR, NDR, and in your perimeter-based tools, again, what made it successful, first, you had an initial compromise using a signed piece of software. That's a lot to ask of your EDR to be able to detect that. I would say that's almost impossible. But then you fall back to, again, Kerberos, remote procedure call, SMB CIFs.
Right.
These don't log, and there's a great deal of opacity. And if there's I can't stress this enough, and I get it, I work for an NDR vendor, but there simply isn't a lot of intelligence in logs in Windows events of those protocols. And so really the only place you can garner intelligence is on the network, and NDR is still being adopted by a lot of folks in the industry. So you can hide using these Microsoft protocols. You can do a lot of bad things. And if you look at a lot of the solutions, a lot of the remediation is forensic driven, right? You're never really in a proactive position because you're looking at a PCAP file and trying to look at a IPC $ access or something like that. Whereas, with RevealX, with NDR solutions, you're able to see that on the fly. So I think one of the main reasons it was able to operate so long was just the opacity around these legacy protocols. Now, that said, I'll bring it home, and I know I promised this wouldn't be an ExtraHop commercial, but again, I would say that we did cite 150% increase in lateral movement.
Yeah.
A lot of that lateral movement was around those legacy protocols, and you really can't monitor that with the SIM. You can't build ML algorithms with the SIM. I guess you could send RevealX metadata to a SIM and build an algorithm, but we're doing that today already. So, from everything from surveillance to actually building effective ML algorithms, all of that happens with the metadata that's based on the wire, and the industry is still adopting that.
Actually, so John, I did not plan on doing this, but to elucidate your point, and I think that this is really important. So we're going to I promise for the less technical, this is a 30-second segue. I'm going to come right back to the more broader level picture. But so, for example, with Sunburst in particular, we saw, like, after the initial compromise and all that sophisticated, very patient stuff, John's made this point indirectly a couple of times. It's really worth doubling down on this. Is like, from there on, it was quite standard stuff, right? Inside the east-west corridor. Okay. So that similar TTPs to other attacks. And from a sort of it's very challenging for certain solutions to like be deterministic about, to like say, well, look, this RPC call is running over SMB, for example, as a layer 7 protocol, right? And then, so being able to correlate these protocols together and back into very, very granular behavioral analysis of the campaign or the discrete attack in some cases, for like, I'm thinking remote service launch and different persistent strategies here, John, specifically. Like, you're seeing these things jump protocols, and that's where like this sort of passive observational, like the network has some interesting properties, regardless of solutions or anything else. All right. The network has some interesting properties. So you kind of can't evade it these days, right? You can't evade it. It's very, very difficult to manipulate and change because it's very disruptive. And then the last one is you can't turn it off really, right? And so, because then nothing really happens. And so the network has some properties as a data source that makes it very, very strategic for the enterprise in our opinion. So, yep. Okay. Now, so we're back to sort of 30,000 feet, and I want to do a time check on myself here. I think we're 20 minutes in or so. This is great. Good. So look, this one, it's not lost on probably anyone listening, or in the industry, how tricky these supply chain compromises can be. And this is one where I was talking some years ago to one of the analysts that were out there about the nature of the supply chain. And there was a node package manager package that had inserted some malware or whatever after a GitHub repo had been transferred. Just last week, we saw the Great Suspender, which was a very, very popular sort of 2 million strong Chrome plugin. And this is a little more on the end user endpoint side, right? But it really does show how tricky these supply chain compromises can be, because, a developer rather changes the ownership of a GitHub repo. That GitHub repo has some sort of under the covers commits, and then bam, 2 million people strong end up with a once useful, the Great Suspender, in this case, a once useful plugin that's now been rendered malware and just disabled everywhere by Google. It's really pretty scary, because it's like, hey man, I'm running on my network right now. I don't want this thing running on my network along with me, right? So what do you think we can do from a visibility perspective or a detection perspective or whatever to help at least minimize and compartmentalize the risk of this supply chain type of attack?
Well, a few things are interesting, right? First, they're not new, right? If you look at NotPetya, the Medoc thing, these are not new. This one was just probably the most complicated, but it really is. You know what it is? It's one of these low effort, very high payoff, because you get one shim into one repo, and the next thing you know, you have, like in the case of the Great Suspender, millions of minions now at your disposal. So I think the big thing in terms of visibility is it's sort of, you talked a little bit earlier today about the threat hunting manifesto, right? You is, first off, you need
the threat modeling manifesto.
Manifesto, but you need to be able to have an understanding of your system's behavior, not user behavior, but how does a system behave, right? Because again, if a system is compromised, its behavior will change drastically, right? It's interesting. I love threat intelligence. I've been using it since before MITRE created sticks, but I can tell you that 10.10.47.36 is never going to come down in your Falcon X feed, right? Or your threat intelligence feed. And you got a lot more to fear from that IP than from any external IP, right? So, being able to have some visibility, have an understanding of what typical behavior patterns are in your environment, whether that's done manually or whether that's done with a machine learning platform like ours, but being able to know when there's a drastic change in behavior. In terms of stopping a supply chain attack, if you look at SolarWinds, everybody did everything right. You're supposed to patch your systems.
Yeah.
So I mean, a lot of these are organizations that did what they're supposed to do. So, I think we need to operate in a world where we're not necessarily going to have an initial compromise. And I think the industry's done that a little bit, right? We've sort of said already, hey, it's not about the perimeter anymore. And believe it or not, while that's become a cliche marketing term, we kind of had to fight to get to that point. I don't think that's going to be as difficult here. I think we're going to have to accept the fact that repos are going to get owned. They're going to get, now these things are going to happen. It's to what extent do you understand the typical behavior of your critical systems in your environment? And can you know when there's an anomaly or when there's a behavior change?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to the threat modeling manifesto a little bit here, and it's not it's a site that was put up recently. It's very, very, very small. It's in fact effectively 2 or 3 pages long, and I found it to be super refreshing because it took the sort of boogeyman impression of this like super advanced process that a SOC would have to invoke or a CISO would have to sponsor through third parties and things like that. And they're making this a pragmatic exercise that's effectively always on as part of the sort of RMF framework itself, right? This sort of never ending, the recursive loop of RMF, right? Assessing your controls. And none of these things make sense outside of like asking really sensible questions, which might inform downstream decisions as it relates to architecture like zero trust, or how you would compartmentalize or respond. So the incident response, practice itself can be the beneficiary of this. And so it's like, well, what can go wrong in my environment? And I'm reading this like, what can go, what are we working on? What goes wrong? What are we going to do about it when it does go wrong? And did we do enough job? Did we do a good enough job if it did go wrong? And so there was a Hacker News thread. I can't remember which thread it was from. One of our colleagues forwarded it, and I think it was an actual engineer who worked on planes, right? Like for Boeing or something. And the assumption was like, we're not going to design for a thing that is always working and can never fail. We have to design for failure. We have to design for failure. And when you make that decision and you flip that bit, it changes everything downstream, right? Because now when it does fail, it's not if it fails, it's like when one of my critical solutions has whichever one, right, has some sort of supply chain compromise, this is what the potential impact is. What are we going to do about it? How are we going to respond? Then you've really leveled up. So for me, I really want to democratize this idea of always on, very simple yet super potent, this practice of threat modeling your environment just in perpetuity. And it's not just the security team. It's upstream. It's over in the CI/CD pipeline with developers. It's downstream at the help desk. It's everywhere, right? So this really should be a ubiquitous practice. And when you decide that you have these sort of points of exposure, it's not like you can just say, well, I'm turning that thing off because it's potentially bad. That's not real. Instead, it's like, okay, if and when it does go bad or something like it, this is how we're going to respond. And again, you and I said this earlier this morning, all roads are sort of converging on zero trust in this way. I think a lot of that is a sort of panacea that we should all aspire to. Whether or not it ever arrives it's all about the journey, to get philosophical, I guess, but
yeah. Yeah. Well, but people can steal creds, people can steal hashes. They can.
Yes.
So
yes.
One of the challenges too is we need to be able to live in a world where someone misuses the trust. So, yep.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, okay, so just a quick check here, John. Hold, please. All right, good, perfect. We're 29 minutes in. So, from a question and answer. Okay, so let's see. So, we've covered off a little bit on tooling strategies. So, and I guess we've talked a little bit about like, how do I make sure I'm not the next, the SolarWinds or whatever. I don't know that anyone could make those assurances. And John, I feel like it really does come back to some combination or the combination of, in a very declarative way, like threat modeling, an active sense of risk, and always on analysis. And when I say always on analysis, to me, it means like, whether or not you feel like you have the resources, like give your teams the ability to like speculatively interact with the data at their disposal. A, to understand more about their environment, to get more situational awareness. B, to understand behaviors over time. And then C, to respond when those behaviors change. Would you add anything to that?
No, I would agree. I would say though, in terms of also when you're looking at your tooling, right, look for opportunities to add context, right? Whether that's marrying EDR and NDR data together, something like that. Demand that your vendors have open REST API capabilities so that you can build further context. It's interesting that we've had a lot of talk about automation, and a lot of companies, and we do it, right? We'll show how we automatically block something, and that's great. But there's a lot of room in between a detection and automatically blocking. Can you automate decorating the incident response, right? Can you add context to the incident response, process, right? That's also
Right.
pretty valuable as
Right.
well, right? And closed platforms are not gonna facilitate that. So, being able to also just make sure that you can inspect as quickly as possible multiple forms of multiple different data sources as well.
Yeah, actually, I'm super glad you said that because I was going to blow right past this, and I really wanted to comment on it. It's just like how efficiently. So the name of the game is like high quality decisions with maximum velocity, right? For just from an operational practice perspective for the CISO, it's like how do I enable my teams to make the highest quality decision as quickly as possible because there's so much to adjudicate. Just the adjudication process of any given event. Is this bad? Do I see an indicator? And in many cases with our customer base, we saw indicators going back, but no subsequent activity at all. No raise in behavior detections, no sort of indicators of sort of some persistent threat. Instead, it was this sort of early on months ago, and then bam, nothing else. And so that adjudication process alone, like, does your team from a high level sort of binary yes or no perspective, do they have the ability to like speculatively look back in time and get very sort of high efficiency, high velocity answers, yes or no? If the answer is no, then that too could change strategy moving forward. So, okay, this next question scares me, frankly, because I have a comment on it. I'm going to let you go first. Do less advanced attackers have the ability to execute supply chain attacks like this, or is this strictly in the realm of APT?
I would say less.
Yeah.
Look, if you can get access to someone's repo, that's not very sophisticated. Now, if you look at SUNBURST, right, if they were able to get access to a repo and push, I think, a binary DLL, I think, that's not super complicated. If you fished somebody or stole someone's creds, that's not that hard. The complicatedness of that SUNBURST attack was what they did post initial compromise. So I would say that it's not that hard. Certainly less sophisticated actors can engage in supply chain attacks. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I really agree, and I'm taking my vendor hat off, and I'm in sort of ops world again. And one of the things that I'm really afraid of from a risk perspective is the sort of democratization of an attack like this, using the advanced TTPs that are now disclosed everywhere and things like that, just like we saw with Eternal Blue, John, right back in the day, where now this advanced, it's now in the realm of not necessarily script kiddies, I would say, but less sophisticated attackers with resources and intent. I think that it's absolutely doable in various different ways. So unfortunately, I hate to say that, but it's really true. And I do think that we're going to see an uptick. If I had to put in, look in my crystal ball, I do think that we're going to see an uptick in supply chain style attacks for sure. Yes, we've seen. So there was another question about how it unfolded in the customer environment, and John's made several different references. Instead of speaking about individual customers, what I'm going to do is zoom out and talk about sort of aggregate behaviors. And now I will actually very actively plug our security report on some retroactive analysis that we did on SUNBURST in particular, where you referred to it a couple of times earlier. Unfortunately, keep me honest here, John, I think it's between March and like early December of last year, we saw an 150% increase in the sort of east-west lateral movement corridor. We saw a 150% increase in detections, I should say, behavioral detections, which correlated really, really closely with SUNBURST activity. So yes, we did unfortunately see this behavior in customer environments across industries, actually.
Yeah. And one of the things we also helped with, though, right, we did have some instances where, yes, there was a compromise, but if it was so crazy. So if they weren't interested in you, whoever the perpetrators were, right, then you were sort of, it was a compromise, but there was the results were largely benign, right? You may have not have had a spike in lateral movement, right? So, that's where I think some of what I'm proudest of our threat research team and of the platform itself is that, when if you're, let's say you're a public health company and you might going to have to disclose, right, being able to look back in time and see just what
Mhm.
exactly happened is very important. I'm not an expert, I'm not a lawyer on what the disclosure rules are or anything like that, but it certainly, I would want to know whether I was obliged to disclose or not, just what the extent of the damage was. And that's the one thing that we did a really good job with. So, there were some instances where it was benign, and
Yeah, it well, benign insofar as they decided to,
or they weren't interested. Yeah, they were
yeah, they
disinterested.
decided to grant mercy to the victim, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and which and again, I don't like. There's a lot of sort of fear mongering in the industry for reasons that are both valid and annoying, frankly. But one of the things that just I'm in privacy mode on my side, just from my own exercise internally and personal life stuff. It's like, how do I segment my network? How do we manage our own risk and things like that? And one of the things that scares me is, they decided to like shut down for a bunch of people, right? And so it just quiesced. Well, we still don't know if there was, information gathered. There clearly was information gathered about the environment. Who was that shared with? It's not like they would leave that value on the table. So, I'm just worried about a sort of second wave of this thing in some way, shape, or form. I have no basis to say that other than my instinct says we've seen this pattern before. We see sort of copycat knockoffs. We see monetization of the assets that they recover because they got in such a way with a privileged system, or at least relatively, or sometimes very privileged, in a way to get inventory and of the estate and the assets there. And they decided to back off, but that doesn't mean someone else would, right?
Yep.
And that is a value. So that's just another thing, and which takes us back to, as part of the strategy, this always on analysis is mandatory. And that's always on analysis, both from the network's perspective, not just the network is no longer just like packet pattern matching and throwing up an alert when some pattern has been matched. It's now about sort of long-term behavioral intelligence and like a first-class analytics data source, right? That's very complementary to your logging. It's very complementary to your threat intel, and it's very complementary to your EDR, especially the modern EDR with ML. Like that's where and the other thing I'll say, just to hopefully disabuse any people that are out that still feel a healthy skepticism, which I understand about machine learning in general, behavioral analytics really does require ML. ML is not some panacea that's going to power your apartment building and detect everything in the world. ML it's a pragmatic, well understood approach to complement the decision making, the velocity of those decisions, and the behavioral context around those decisions.
Yeah, for sure. I'm really, yeah, I'm really happy with how this played out. I certainly am not happy for anyone's sorrows at all in terms of the calamity that this caused. But I sort of knew that there was good metadata on the wire, and that machine learning in terms of looking at network metadata would evolve to being able to deliver some really nice findings, some really useful, information. And if it, I, if you look at the report, that's exactly what happened, right? And I see another question where I think someone's saying, could anyone have detected this attack sooner? Here's the problem: we didn't detect the attack, right? It was a signed piece of software that came down from an approved source, and so I don't think I hate FUD, and I hate saying that these things are inevitable, but I think we just can't count on being able to see the initial compromise, especially when they get access to a repo. What we can count on is a drastic change in behavior of the nodes that have been impacted by it.
Yeah, there's one more. Yeah, there's another question, John, about, and it's probably, given we're 40 minutes in, this is maybe another session, but like asking us to sort of compare this to the dependency confusion attack technique, right? And to me, these are all, without getting into too many specifics, frankly, myself, I'd like to do more research on this sort of deeper details, technical details of the dependency confusion attack technique, but just put succinctly, like, that's a vector into some subsequent attack like this. And this technique, substitution attacks, it's a way to sneak in malicious code. It's another version of this software. There's, by the way, from a sort of supply chain side, there are many different supply chains, obviously, and there are many different types of attack you can level. Some are physical supply chains, like in the case of Maersk, for example, right? They just shut down a global supply chain. Others are technical. It's very similar to security controls, physical controls versus technical, and so on. And so this, to me, looks like another sort of forward step in the trend of slipping in bad stuff into very popular or even ubiquitous, in this case, software. John, any perspective on that or comments before we wrap?
No, I believe I'm looking at some of the more. I had a discussion with this with a customer not long ago, and this probably does need its own session. But what I would say, it's interesting because you see some new custom DNS servers showing up, and I don't know if you remember when we first moved into security, we would get all these DNS servers that weren't in resolve.com.
Yeah.
They weren't in anybody's IP settings. And all of a sudden, these new DNS servers started showing up, right? So, again, DNS is tough to log. God, I would love to do a session on this. DNS is really tough to log. I would say impossible to log in a large organization. Doing it on the wire is actually quite trivial, and it's a very good story for us. If you look at my LinkedIn post, you'll see a half dozen, posts about how we can monitor DNS. But yeah, I think that one should be its own session, because that is another interesting supply chain attack for sure.
It is. So let's do that. We'll set that expectation for the folks here. I would love to do it, and thanks for making the time. This is our first one that you and I have done, so I'm stoked to have done it, and hopefully it was of value to you all that are out there. And we want to thank you for that. And we do have a couple of things. So one of our lead ML researchers that's out there, Todd Kemmerling, did a great couple of blog posts on the site, and definitely download the security report if that is of interest to you. And also take advantage of we have an online demo at ExtraHop where you can sign in and self-guide or take a guided tour of what we're talking about when we talk about always-on analysis and this sort of next generation of network-based analytics, and specifically NDR, network detection and response. And so we would love for you to check that out as well. And in the meantime, I guess we can sign off. John, any closing comments?
No, I would just say, hey, this is LinkedIn. If you want to have a conversation with either Matt or myself, link in with us, DM us.
That's a good point.
And we're happy to, if you want to, if you're not ready to talk to a salesperson, but you want to talk to a nerd, if you want to have a nerd to nerd conversation, we will certainly answer any of those that you want to have. So feel free to reach out.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everybody. Thanks, John.
Yeah,
I'll talk to you next time.